Welcome to Innovation Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. On this episode, we're back with our mini-series, Longevity for Investors, with my great co-host, Dr. Greg Bailey. If you've missed our previous episodes, Greg's got incredible background, not just as a medical doctor in an emergency room for 10 years, but in the investment field. A couple of his biggest wins people know about are Medivation and Biohaven. At Biohaven, they bought in. One was a $12 million company, and eventually it sold for $14.3 billion. And at Medivation, they bought in. One was a $3 million company, and they have been listed now on the New York Stock Exchange. I think I looked at the weekend, it was about $3 billion, and they've already sold an $11.6 billion migraine medicine called Nurtec. And on this week's episode, we get to have somebody I feel like I know a bit because I've been listening to all the podcasts and YouTube videos with him and reading his amazing website. But Karl Pfleger is kind of legendary in the longevity and biotech space for having such a clear mission of moving the business forward. Extremely smart individual, having spent a background in artificial intelligence and 10 years at Google doing all sorts of things, decided to get involved in the space initially from a philanthropic standpoint, donating to the Buck and other great institutions, and eventually decided that he could make more of a difference for his fellow human beings having healthy years on Earth by becoming an investor himself. And seeing some of the deficiencies in the space, he created one of the most helpful websites in the world on the subject. If you haven't been to AgingBiotech, you need to go there. He's got everything broken down into structured data, so you can see how things correlate with each other. You've got all these tables that are sortable. He's got some of the best podcasts, the best books. He's got so many things. And something I appreciate, the About section of the website tells you exactly what's included and what's not and why. And then he denotes what's updated or not. And it's just, for someone like me who is new to longevity biotech, it's been very helpful. And so I was very happy when he said he had time to come talk to Greg and I. Karl, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's an honor.
So I missed a whole bunch of things. Why don't you give us a couple of the highlights that I missed? And then why don't you start by giving us a 30,000 foot view of how you see the longevity biotech investment space?
You mean missed in my bio kind of thing?
Yeah.
You covered most of it. So a Stanford PhD in computer science where I did artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that was finished that early 2000s. So I mostly did that in the 90s, went before deep neural nets were big. Worked doing practical big data at Google for a decade, and then thought for a while I might go into global poverty reduction, thought about getting a PhD in development economics, and decided that the science of aging was at least as good from a sort of effective altruism, lives saved per hour of my time or per dollar of my money. And I'm more of a scientist than I am a lobbyist. So, and I lived here in San Francisco, where it was sort of ground zero for aging science and biotech development. So, started with philanthropy, as you said. At some point, I decided to start investing, primarily because at the time the NIH budget was sort of dwindling on a real basis. And it was the beginning of people in the field really getting used to funding more scientific studies with venture money and not just grant money. And some companies were starting, BioAge started then, and that was sort of my wake-up call. I was like, because Kristen and I had been talking a bunch, and I was like, I should probably start investing too, and instead of just doing, philanthropic money. So the website, AgingBiotech.info, grew directly out of the investing, because when I started that, I just started making a list of all the companies that I encountered at every conference and I've heard about everywhere. And suddenly my list of companies was 5 times longer than every single roundup I saw anybody else produce. And I thought to myself, well, there are probably other investors in the field who know this, but it would be probably better if the whole world got a sort of open source, sort of wiki-like version of this that for free, instead of me keeping it secret like most of the other investors who had preceded me into the field. So that was also grew out of, as you said, a frustration of mine that there was lots of stuff written about the field at the time, books, blogs, articles, most of which were just blobs of paragraphs of prose. And I wanted there to be something more structured, something where you could easily compare things, lined up in columns, and do good restricts and sorts and narrow down quickly to what you needed. And so everything on the website is a table, which is sortable and restrictable. And so it started as just basically a list of the companies, but you could do the sorting and restricting so that you could do things like figure out where they were in clinical trials, or are they diagnostics or therapeutics, et cetera, which different area of the sub area of the field, like senescence, are they focused on? And so that's sort of half my day job now is maintaining that, and half of it is doing investing in the early stage biotechs in the field. Specifically, I cover the whole field on the website, and I invest specifically in the rejuvenation subset. And we could talk more about that. So you asked about sort of the 30,000 foot view of the field, right? So the most important thing that everybody in the whole world should know about aging, right? And this is in the About page. Thanks for calling that out. Not enough people read the About page on the site. But this is explicitly talked about in there, right? Is that the most important thing, sort of 3 or 4 things everybody should know in the whole world, is that aging is not a sort of atomic clock that ticks continuously and you can't do anything to change it. That it is mutable or malleable process. Things can make it go faster or slower. And that's now very clear from decades of good science. The idea of, I mentioned effective altruism, the idea of saving more lives through interfering with that process is one of the most effective altruistic, best uses of money that society could do, whether it's government money or individual philanthropic money or investment money. So it's sort of worthy is the word I use. And then that it's lucrative, that, it's going to be a revolution, like many revolutions that have come before it, that's going to fundamentally change society, and that people who invest in it earlier are going to, some subset of them are going to get really impressive returns, just like happened in the .com revolution and is happening now with artificial intelligence. And the geroscience hypothesis is the most important thing, which is that the way healthcare works today, it's really more of a sick care model. You wait until the dike has, the dam has holes in it before you start plugging the holes. You wait until somebody has a clinical level of disease before you start treating the disease. And that happens sort of in the later parts of life. In the earlier parts of life, for decades before that, there are molecular pathological changes that underlie, that are just sort of characteristic and make up really biological aging. And they underlie all the major chronic diseases that are the top killers. 70% of deaths globally, 92+% in Western developed countries. And the geroscience hypothesis is basically that if we treat those underlying molecular changes of aging decades before clinical levels of the killer top diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, etc., happen, we can actually delay or interfere with or help fix all of the different chronic diseases. So that's the geroscience hypothesis, and that's sort of I think we're almost at the point where we can stop calling it a hypothesis at this point. We just don't have actual human studies yet, but it's pretty clear from most of the data and most of the understood biology. So that's sort of the most important set of things to know. The 30,000 foot view of the field in terms of what different people talk about when they call it longevity, I think there are 3 main different areas. One is, what can you do with lifestyle to speed up or slow down your aging? With just what can normal people do even without their doctor, just on their own, right? So diet, exercise, sleep, don't abuse alcohol, don't be, a bunch of stuff like that. The second thing is what doctors can do with what's available now. So that's, adds to the lifestyle stuff. It adds prescription drugs and, diagnostic tests that you can access if you're a physician that you can order. And of course includes all the supplements and lifestyle stuff. And then the third thing is what's coming. And so that's the area that Greg and I invest in. That's the stuff that's both in human clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, and in preclinical work, which is where the biotech startups and the pharma companies are doing rodent and other animal models before they go into humans, and then even earlier stage than that, the stuff that's in academia. And so those are the sort of 3 main things. And the different people you see in the field will talk about, only the first and the second, or only the first, or sometimes only the third. But I think it's important to sort of understand where those three are and how you can compare, what you mean when you're talking about aging or longevity with respect to one of those three.
That's great. Greg, what kind of questions is this bringing up for you?
Karl's a kindred spirit, so singing to the choir here. We met probably in 2018, looking at projects and seeing the evolution of this, and it was so important that people like Karl and myself came to the table early, because the more money that comes in, the faster this is going to accelerate. And so that I think you, Karl, both of us probably agree that's the key thing. How can we convince the people who are listening to this podcast that you can invest, and if you do, it's a remarkable difference. And
we met partly because we were looking at some of the same companies, and that was that was what turned me on to Juvenescence in the first place.
Yeah, and it's exciting. And fortuitously at Juvenescence, this month we launched 2 drugs that could materially change people's aging trajectory, one that has the potential to add 10 healthy years, which was always the initial goal. So, Karl, when you look at this and mindful of an audience that is looking at this for the first time, trying to explore how to do it, how would you recommend that they get into this? How do they get caught up? Because the number of people I'm sure you've had who say, I don't have an MD or PhD, I can't invest. So how can the people who don't have those 2 certificates begin to get involved like you did?
Right. Okay. So there's a couple different routes here depending on what your day job is and what your future career prospects are. So let me tell you what happened with me, but it's not the only way. And then I'll lay out a broader palette, right? So what happened with me was I had a good career in one field and I was ready for a change. And I decided that this was the most important field in the world. So I both wanted to help it, but I also wanted to personally understand it in detail and in depth, because it was very clear, for example, that knowing when the revolution happens, knowing how to navigate the early parts will be helpful. This is similar to what happened, for example, in the .com era. You got, yes, there was a whole bunch of great stuff coming along, but in the beginning, it was messy, and the people who understood it better could better place, not just what they used, but their investments, and how they lived their life and letting it improve their lives better. So I decided I wanted to dive in and know some of this stuff. So part of the reason I actually started the investing was actually to, as I said, to get more capital in the field. But the other part was actually to learn the field better. I was learning biology on my own anyway, but you actually really speed up learning something when you're actually investing in it. Doing the diligence really makes you, like, I was learning a bunch of stuff, but then all of a sudden, every company that I diligenced, whether I invested or not, was a super crash course that was super interesting and exciting. And doing it as a diligence project made it so much faster to learn what was going on. So I actually feel a lot more informed now from my investing. Not everybody's going to want to dive in like that, but I do recommend that this is a sort of a unique area where everybody's personal health is somewhat their responsibility, right? Some people like to work on their cars. Other people are willing to completely outsource that to a mechanic. There are lots of people who have that attitude about their own bodies. They're willing to just outsource it to their doctor. They think that just like their computer or their car, when the body breaks, they just take it there and they get mad at the doctor if they can't fix it. But the fact of the matter is, everybody should understand that we don't have a full map of the human and full understanding of human biology the way that we do of, computers and cars and things that we've made. And so there's a little bit of a personal responsibility aspect there. And so I'm willing to, just even as a side project, even if this wasn't my day job, I'm willing to really put in a reasonable amount of spare time as a hobby, as a side thing. There's just the way that people go to the gym, right? There's a little bit of like, you should know this stuff. Everybody should know a bare minimum of this stuff. So I'm not a fan of the whole, I just want to throw money at this and go away and not spend any time of my own intellect thinking about it. But some people want to do that. So to answer your question, right, it depends on what kind of person you are, right? If you have a huge day job that you spend 80 hours a week on and you have zero time to devote to this, but you want to put money in it, then obviously you have to find somebody at the meta level to invest in. You either have to have a friend who like tells you which companies to invest in, or you have to give your money to a VC fund or to an umbrella company like Juvenescence, which itself is a meta collection of multiple different assets. But that only pushes the diligence up one level, because then you have to diligence them. And so then it's all about like, do you think they're the right people to make the choices for you? Which is a hard job, in some ways a harder job than looking at the individual biotech companies. So my preference, so then there's the other side of the spectrum is you learn everything and you invest in the individual companies. And then in between there's, you do a mix and you learn somewhat. And, so obviously like Jess, for example, is taking the mixed approach where this isn't all he thinks about the way it is all I think about, but he's also obviously diving in and thinking about a lot of it and doing the series and doing a lot of reading. And so that's where most people, I think, fall, is in this in-between area. So what should people actually look at if they want to come up to speed, right? I mean, obviously it's listen to this podcast and, and some others. And in fact, one of the reasons I wrote or created the AgingBiotech.info site is exactly for this use case. So I wanted lots of investors who were on the side to have a good resource to quickly get as much up to speed as they can handle. And so, from if you're a rich person or if you run a fund or if you just want to dive into this space because you haven't been, right, there's a bunch of books on the AgingBiotech.info/books list. There's a bunch of podcasts. Almost all the books are available as audiobooks. And so those two resources plus the videos list, which most of the videos on the videos list can be listened to without watching the video. You can just do the audio only. And so those three things are all audio sources, which makes them special because the people who even the busiest 60, 80 hours a week type people have time where they're walking or cooking or at the gym or driving where they can listen to that. So those are sort of a good entry point for the busiest people. The next level down is if you really want to be into the space, you should do some reading. And so there's a list of best blogs and news sources. And there's a list of the best conferences, because one of the things you need to do is start actually networking. And the conferences is a good place to start. And sort of a lot of the really interesting stuff gets learned there that doesn't necessarily appear in the formal literature, or doesn't appear as quickly in the formal literature. So those are sort of the beginning resources. And then the companies list, which is what started the website, is a great list of what's related to what, and what's, you're looking at something in a particular area. Here's a bunch, you can quickly find a bunch of other things to compare it to. And so that's a great resource as well. And then there's others, but I think that's probably good enough for the first level answer of your question.
Good answer. I'm going to ask you a question and ask Jess a question. So after you answer, we can flip to Jess. So can people invest alongside you? You've obviously done a deep dive. So that's the question for you, Karl. And for you, Jess, you are just getting into this. So you are where Karl and candidly I was a few years back. And so how are you finding your way in, and where do you agree, disagree, or how would you like to augment what Karl has just said? But first we'll start with Karl. Can people invest alongside you?
So technically right now I'm an angel. I don't have a fund that people can invest.
But can they co-invest? Find out that you're investing in X and then invest along.
I don't have a formalized syndicate. If AngelList hadn't gone the weird bifurcation route, I might have done that as a low cost way. But I'm happy to network with people who want to start investing in the field. I love to compare diligence with people and recommend companies. I'm regularly connecting with new investors in the space and telling them which companies I love and which ones I know of have open rounds. My LinkedIn profile has my portfolio listed on it. And I update that pretty regularly whenever there's a new company. So, and then occasionally my X/Twitter feed or my LinkedIn will talk about some of my favorite companies if they have updates, or I did a roundup post a little while ago about why I'm cautiously optimistic about the rejuvenation subset of the field, and it rounded up several different areas and mentioned a couple specific companies. So yes, so it's not, there's no direct feed to follow along, but I'm happy to connect to people who are serious. about bringing money into the space and diving in and learning. And I go to conferences pretty regularly, especially the ones on the West Coast of the U.S.
Jess, how do you think about learning to invest in this?
I mean, certainly there's so much information, it can be very overwhelming, right? I think what's giving me some element of comfort, though, is going through all these different kinds of resources, like what Karl is talking about. And for me, especially like the longevity conferences that are on YouTube, and getting to hear some of the experts on the same panel, having their disagreements and agreements, right? And then this series has obviously been great to be able to hear directly from people. And, you know, I get the enviable thing of we get to have the conversation after the conversation when the recording goes off and they're like, I didn't want to say this on camera, but you know, I just started posting about it multiple times a week on my LinkedIn, and I'm getting quite an influx of people in the space because it's not as mercenary as most parts of finance in my experience. Like there's a lot of people here for the mission. And so I'm getting high credibility people, PhDs, CEOs of other companies, just wanting to connect on LinkedIn. We'll hop on a Zoom. And I do want to bring up that I didn't know Karl was an investor in Juvenescence before I invited him on the show. I had just enjoyed him on these podcasts and these YouTube videos. I guess I have a little bit of a problem with people who treat their point of view like a religion. And so for me, I'm trying to go through all these sources, and I'm typically looking for people. They can have a strongly held opinion, but if their approach is objective and it's obvious they're willing to change their mind based on new data, and they're not just asking me, like, are they willing to cite sources? That's a huge one for me. Do I just have to take their word for it because they had said, oh, and we found this out, instead of willing to cite, well, who found it out and what did they find out? I find that those people kind of travel in a pack, actually. So like, I wasn't that shocked to find out Karl had already invested in Juvenescence with you and you two already knew each other, because I am finding more and more of the people who are willing to like bring scientific rigor are also more likely to be the people to bring like objectivity to investing instead of maybe some other more emotionally based responses. And so and quite frankly, like I asked you all about each other behind each other's backs. Well, what do you think of so-and-so? And what do you think they've got going for them? What do you think they've got going against them? And you know, when those are offline conversations, it's you know, everybody talks about Warren Buffett's mentor, Phil Fisher, who wrote Security Analysis and most famously The Intelligent Investor. Less people talk about his other mentor who he would say reflects more of his current investing style now. His partner, Charlie Munger, got him into Phil Fisher. And like Phil Fisher's got a great book, Common Stocks, Uncommon Profits. And he was very into focus investing. He was not about like spray and pray. He was like, find out everything you absolutely can. And, you know, it's kind of like Andrew Carnegie, put all your eggs in one basket and then watch them like a hawk, right? But he called it scuttlebutt. He's like, so call their salespeople, they'll talk to you, call the vendors, call the people who got fired from that company. Like just start finding out all around, and you're going to get a way better sense, like a much more three-dimensional sense of what actually goes on there. And so by literally just commenting on other people's LinkedIn stuff on longevity, posting my own, doing the episodes, you know, I'm now starting to get invited to some of the meetings, and then just having an offline conversation. Who are you impressed with in the area? What do you like about them? Hey, what about these guys? What do you think about them? And it's just like a correlation of responses I get in common considering the sources. That's kind of a complicated answer, I guess, but that's what I'm finding. And then just, again, you know, luckily, Greg, you're emailing me all these things and I read these big, long reports. And, you know, I'm just constantly just searching on YouTube. Did a new longevity conference come out? And that's kind of my long-winded answer.
Well, let me just follow up on three things you said if you're done.
Yeah.
So first of all, you mentioned conference videos. So the list, AgingBiotech.info/videos, has sort of all the best video channels in the field. And several of the good conferences in the field have channels, and then the talks from the conference show up on that channel. And so that's one way to sort of find several of the different good talks if you missed the conference. But your comment about posting on LinkedIn, right? Have conversations. The more you have conversations about the science and the space and the sector and the investments in companies, right? Conversations on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on any, in person at the conferences, by email, the more you make contacts, just the more you have conversations, the more you'll get a sense of what's bullshit and what's real. And then you mentioned sort of what people say behind the, off the record about other people, right? It is important to realize that this field, and that's actually, I kind of think of this as a sign of success. Early in the field, everyone was sort of patting each other on the back, gung-ho, supportive. You mentioned how it's not as sort of cutthroat and as sort of finance world. And I think it's still like that in general compared to the finance world, right? There's a lot of companies where even the competitors within a certain subsector of the space feel that any success from one of their competitors actually just boosts all the boats in that subsector. But that being said, there are a lot of different cliques in the field who don't particularly like the other cliques, or, there's a couple different strong divisions in the field, and you'll get a sense of those. But, so it's important to know that sort of who you connect with at the beginning might bias you toward certain views of the field that you might get a different view if you talk to somebody else. But so you don't want to completely dismiss one half of the field because you happen to talk to the other half first and they badmouth the other half. But those divisions aren't too strong yet. And I think that that's only natural as a field gets bigger.
I want to turn the tables. Greg, you'd spent 10 years in ER as a medical doctor. You'd been an investor for over 10 years. You'd done stuff in real estate. I mean, obviously you started in biotech originally, but then you did stuff in real estate. You'd done stuff in medical devices and different things. What was effective for you? I mean, you obviously your results would indicate you learned it well, but you weren't a PhD and you weren't coming out of investment banking or something like this. What worked for you?
And I'll be interested to get Karl for you to respond to what I think. To me, it's all about the people. I was on a phone call with one of the more senior banks, and he had his whole team, and he said, Greg's remarkable for what he did because he took drugs that no one else would finance and turned them into multi-billion-dollar companies. I said, completely wrong. He said, Greg took great people, adequately financed them, because the first drugs I bet on, both of them have not been the successful one. It was the next drugs. So it's to Karl's point about getting a bias, from the one sector, one group that doesn't like the other group. But on the whole, I think it's very collegial, and I'm very excited about that. But yeah, no, it's about the people, and so you try to understand. Just again, going back to what Karl said, who do I trust and why? And, and there's things you look for. Have they done it before? In my case, I was less worried about the science and more worried about the drug developer, because that's where a lot of these come with great science. It's who can actually shepherd them through the clinical trials in an efficient model and are willing to cut off something that doesn't. So find great people. I mean, and accolades to what Karl's done. I think he is the prototype for what people should do in looking at this sector. His website is perfect for somebody wanting to get started. And then you can see within that, who should I speak to? Back to your point, Jess. Like this guy is very good. Huberman. I should talk to Sinclair. Maybe I should reach out to James Perry. Like there's all these people with it, or Kristen Fortin, you have huge respect for. Or just listen to them, in the conferences they attend and how they're thinking about it. But this is going to be, McKinsey just came out, Karl, as you know, and said this is $1.8 trillion industry in the next few years. If you even have a company that's marginally successful and has a drug that does 100 billion of the 1.8 trillion, you're talking about one of the most valuable companies in the world. So, Karl, in this, and how people think about it, well, what was it for you that makes your decision about who to invest in?
Okay, so I want to answer that. Let me just, since you touched on the size of the market, I would just point out that, there's a paper that just came out, an economic analysis of what would the value to society be if
Yes,
you could extend everybody's healthy lifespan by 1 year? And Andrew Scott, an economist, was the top author, and the value they came up with was $37 or $38 trillion would be the value, and it scaled. So 10 years of healthy life extension would generate something like 360 billion or trillion dollars. So $360 trillion. So it scaled. It was 10x more, or almost 10x more per 10x as much stuff. And so, obviously the investment returns are only some portion of that, but I totally believe the number you gave. It's going to be a giant market when it comes. Okay, so how do I look at things? So you gave, Greg, sort of a very common answer in investing in early stage companies across all sectors. Is sort of the team is super important, and I agree with that. However, I'm a little bit on the other end of the spectrum of views on that. And this isn't necessarily that I think that that's a bad way, but in terms of how I personally do it, let's just engage with the argument for why is the team so important, right? The team is important, and the classical argument here in early stage investing in general, especially in tech, which is where this is most commonly talked about, and where I come from before aging, is that if the team is good, they'll pivot if the idea doesn't work, and they'll create something that still has value, and that'll be great. The counter argument, speaking broadly, not specifically in biotech or in aging, which I've heard a lot Gil give, is basically that if you invest in the right sector or in the right idea, then it's gonna work. Somebody's gonna get it. It's gonna obviously a team that's really bad, it can screw anything up. But if they're adequate, then the sector will lift all boats. I tend to invest. Part of the team argument is sort of opportunistic. It's feed forward. It's if your goal is to make money and you invest in the right team, you're more likely to make the money. My view of part of the reason why I do the investing isn't just to make money. In fact, it's secondary or tertiary maybe. The main goal is to get the result, right? So it's goal-directed investing. So I want to see success against these targets or in these areas of aging. And so to me, the most important thing is the mechanism of action. So I want the science to be right. And so my primary thing that I look at is, having learned what's important in the field, I want certain problems to be solved, and I'm investing in companies to have multiple shots on goal of solving these key problems, so that if any of them solve it, then that would be great for the world. So for example, I identify as many of the problems that I think are core to aging that all definitely need to be solved to have a robust solution. And I try to find any companies that are working in that area. And then there's a bar for team and a bar for, early data and why this is the right idea for that, the right time for that idea, and competitive landscape, and can they really raise the next round and things like that. And as long as they meet those bars, obviously team, there's, a good reasonable pedigree or real demonstrated intellect and ability to go get it and get stuff done. And obviously track record is important, but the field is so new. There's a lot of people who are enthusiastic of the field who don't have track record. So you still have to judge between them. And so it's partly the goal-directed aspect that gets me to talk about think about MOA first and foremost, and partially also personal short giving. Like, I feel more confident having learned enough about the field to judge what's an important mechanism of action and what's a reasonable idea to pursue, then I feel able to judge the people, right? Judging a good team is hard. And so some people think they have a good gift for that, and maybe some of the subset of those are actually good investors. I don't feel I have a secret ability to outdo other investors in that particular thing. I can judge to a certain bar, but I think rather my forte is figuring out which are the good mechanisms and reasonable approaches to the field, and the ones that will combine together. It's not just about investing in a single molecule because it's going to be successful and putting together a portfolio of unrelated successful molecules. For me, it's about putting together all the pieces needed to fully solve the problem. We're not there yet, but I could talk about, if you want, some of the different favorite areas, like Senolytics, for example, that I think the pieces are there now, and some of the big companies that are going to be super successful exist. But unfortunately, not all of the areas have that yet.
Well, I kind of want to ask maybe a little higher level question, and then we could go deep later. For people who, so quite frankly, a lot of people who are guests on the show, I stay friends with them. I stay in touch with them afterwards. We become friends. Maybe they come to one of my events or something, and it ends up they're like, kind of. There's this thing like after you make a lot of money, your health becomes even more important because you want to enjoy it. Okay, right? So there's a lot of folks really into biohacking and understanding longevity and building a sustainable lifestyle so they can actually enjoy this life because they, maybe they abuse their money a little bit, abuse their body a little bit, making this money in the first place, right? And so there are a lot of folks who haven't been in this space who are considering it. I mean, in their offline conversations with me, right? Maybe a question for both of you. Let's start with you, Karl, though, is I would love, you guys have both been in this space for years. I would love to hear you talk to one of my friends who, maybe they exited a big tech company and they're thinking about putting some of the money in this. Why now? Why is now a good time for this space? What's going on now, or what in the arc of this space? Why is now a special time?
So it's been about 2 or 3 decades since it really became very clear to the scientists that aging was very malleable. You could change one gene and worms could live 10x longer. That blew people's minds when it happened in Cynthia Kenyon's lab. It's taken a little while to get from that to enumerating some of the really good, how many pathways and ways to adjust things there are. But when I got into the field in the early 2010s, there were, less than 20 or 25 or 30 companies, and there wasn't even there wasn't a subspecialty within biology that you could even study academically. It was a very small set of people doing it. By 2017, when I started investing, 2016 when I decided to start investing, and 2017 when I first did deals, we were up to probably 50 to 100 biotech startups in the space, and that in the first year of making my list that became the website in 2018, I quickly got to over 100, and now there's 400 or 500. So the space is basically exploding. So if you want to make an analogy to another field, I'd say that we're to the sort of 1990s .com World Wide Web explosion. I'd say we're sort of 1994, 1995, which is obviously like 3 or 4 years before it really got super, super big. And of course, then there was a crash. That might happen here too. But, now a decade, 2 decades post that crash, those tech companies dominate the global economy. So I think we're on that beginning trajectory. I think that bio is a little slower than tech. And so I think that what took place in sort of 1993 to 2000 in sort of .com world might take twice as long or 3 times as long in this sector. But I think we're at that. It's already started taking off point, and you can kind of see it in the. I've got graphs I made from the website that show sort of amount of invested money and amount of employees at all the companies and total number of companies and all kinds of other things, and they're all going up and to the right in sort of the way you would expect.
Yeah, Greg, what do you have to add?
I actually, when I to talk on this subject, I talk about it being where generated AI was 3 years ago. That first drug is going to come out, and it's going to add 10 years, and everybody's going to, oh my God, where's the next one? Because it's going to be huge. And the other thing is, we've had our first demonstration, which I've mentioned on previous podcasts, of a drug, which is anti-aging, and what the size of the market is. And that's the diabetes, obesity drugs, Ozempic, and such like. They don't anti-age in the concept of what Karl and I were looking for on a cellular basis. They do it by decreasing your chance of getting metabolic disease, neurological disease, heart disease. So you will live longer. And we now know that they will do somewhere, most people say between 100 and 150 billion dollars a year. So if you have that drug that does this prevention and adds these healthy years, you're talking about numbers probably higher than that. So this is that point. And when that first drug gets what's a proof of concept in a phase 2 clinical trial, maybe a phase 1/2A, which phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is when you show it works. But a lot of these have biomarkers. So you're going to know safety and that the marker's knocked down. So you have a viable drug. Once the world starts to see them, this explodes. The money explodes. And to Karl's point, why now? It's because of the money that's flowing in and the tracking that he's doing, where you see this, because the more money that comes in, which is the purpose of this podcast from my perspective, is can we convince more people to put more money, because this will come faster, quicker, and it will make a bigger change to you and to everyone you love and like. Unfortunately, some of the people you don't like are also going to benefit from that, but that's something we can't control. So yeah, now is the right time. Back to you, Jess.
Yeah. No.
So let me just
go ahead, Karl.
make it what Greg said. So, all early stage company investing is really a bet where you have a very low chance of success for any individual company and a pot of gold if you're right?
Huge.
So it's multiply the pot of gold, large number, times the small chance of success, right? And that's what happens in biotech too. You have a very small chance of a drug going through clinical trials successfully, but you get a huge return if you do, right? And that's standard biotech. What's different in the aging field, because of the geroscience hypothesis, right, is that if you're really attacking something that's fundamental about aging, then you still have to go through for some particular indication, that's because aging is not considered a disease at the moment. So you can't go through trials for aging directly. So you go through for some other indication. But then if it works and it does address fundamental aging, if it gets on the market, then suddenly you can do label expansion and get approved much more easily for other indications, and people can prescribe it off label. So as a result, you have the same small chance of success, but instead of being multiplied by one pot of gold, it's multiplied by 10 to 50 pots of gold. And so this is why I think it's actually a really lucrative part of biotech and it's going to sort of slowly grow and eat a lot of the rest of pharma and biotech, this sort of old sick care model version.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, I'll maybe make one comment and turn it over to you, Greg, for the last question here. I also watch a lot of shows about the venture capital industry on a whole, specifically the podcasts that interview LPs, the investors in VC funds, family offices, pension funds, university endowments, stuff like this. And there's some really interesting quantitative analysis that's been done around like a early stage to outlier type of statistics. So in general tech, this is according to a 10th generation family office that's very kind of known as one of the most quantitative folks in early stage tech. Early stage VC, Jamie Rhodes. And essentially their analysis was that out of every 50 qualified early stages, venture investable early stages, you saw about one outlier. And but in bio, they saw it 1 in 10. And they said, an outlier, like especially like, and they did it regionally. So like, an outlier in New York was typically 5.4 billion, where an outlier in California was 9 billion, and that was LA and SF. And she said, like, the outliers in bio aren't as big. They aren't as big, but they are, according to their analysis, 5 times as often. And guess what? 1 in 10 is still a real gamble, people. Like, don't put it all, as Greg says, don't put it all on one. Only put 1% of your net worth into something. Like be smart, spread this out, and don't just think 10 and you're done. You know what I mean? Like statistically, you've got 1 in 10, but statistics, you may need more than that 10 to get your 1, right? And so like this idea of like bring a little wisdom, like yes, you should be scared that any one has a very low probability of getting that 50 pots of gold, but this has been around. Biotech has been around long enough, and venture capital in general has been long enough that you can bring some objectivity to it and say, yes, I think I'm a good picker. And just in case I'm not, I'm going to do a reasonable amount of diversification and worsen my return in order to increase my probability that I get 1 to 2 outliers. But Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you to a final question for Karl here.
One thing I'll say to the audience is it's 1 in 10 if you're doing early stage. If you're doing things that are closer to the clinic, you can get down to, 20%, 30%. And then you still got the 50 pots of gold. And the other thing is that, and I reiterate what Karl said, and that is that the numbers here are staggering. And this is a problem for the biotech mafia who invest, the VCs, because they're thinking, oh, you have a good drug, you do $4 billion in sales. But what we know for these things, it'll do 100 billion in sales. So you've got a whole different metric, but scattered around, as you've said, Jess. So, Karl, for the audience, they're looking for one area that they should feel comfortable, should look at, should study, should go on your website and learn all about that area. What is it in this sector?
Cellular fluorescence and senolytics. It's my pick for what will is more likely than anything else to really put the field on the map with early successes. And I think it will apply to everybody, unlike the obesity drugs, for example, which probably won't help people who are lean. Senescent cells are these pathological cells, and periodically getting rid of them by killing them seems to have huge beneficial effect. And there's multiple different companies, at least a dozen plus, working on that. It's a little bit like killing cancer cells, but easier because they don't divide, so they can't evolve around your therapy. So once we solve the problem, it's not going to, unlike cancer, it's not going to last another several decades. The cure will be the cure once we find it. And there's several really good companies in the space. People are going to hear more and more about this in popular media. There's 20 plus age-related conditions that all have good evidence that these pathological cells, the accumulation of long-lived, persistent of these cells plays a role. And so I think this is my favorite, area. There's some other areas like epigenetic reprogramming that might be bigger in the long run, but they're just farther away at the moment. And so learning about that is also just super important for people's personal health. Like, it's super
great area to highlight. And just quickly, so these are cells which you clear up quite well when you're younger, and unfortunately, as you age, you don't. And they're basically, I think the best description I've heard is zombie cells. They cease to do what they're supposed to do, and unfortunately, they leak. And when they leak, they cause inflammation and all the pathology that Karl has just spoken about. Karl, do you have any questions for us before we sign off?
No, I just encourage you guys to keep doing the series and, branch out to hit more people and to more diverse set of people in the field. But I'm sure that will happen.
Be a fantastic outcome.
And everybody should learn about the field as much as they can, whatever resources they want. There's lots of resources linked on AgingBiotech.info, so you don't have to take my word for it. There's, in fact, most of the tables have one of the tabs is other people's lists of the same thing, so you can go compare to other people's lists to the one that I've got on the site, and don't have to just take my personal opinion.
Well, thanks for making time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Okay, everyone. Bye for now.